once in a while, an artist comes along and creates work so intense and so well crafted that they can't sustain it for long. This was the case when King Crimson wrote and recorded the album Red in 1974. Crimson had been producing some of the most innovative and influential rock music of its time since 1969, but Red was the last album the band produced in its first form before splitting up. And this split up didn't happen suddenly. Ever since the band released its first album, In the Court of the Crimson King, their lineup had changed at least once a year, sometimes in the middle of tours. King Crimson has always been praised for its musical creativity and for pushing the boundaries of rock and several other genres, but it seems like that same relentless creativity also drove the band in different directions. This means that King Crimson as a band has always existed in a state of change and unrest. The only constant member of the band throughout its history has been guitarist, keyboardist, and producer Robert Fripp. Now, just about every member who's passed through King Crimson has made a notable contribution to the band's style, but Robert Fripp has been the driving force behind the band and the deciding factor in whether King Crimson continues to exist. Well, this is the album that led to him calling it all to a halt, at least for a few years. And fortunately, there couldn't be a better finale album than Red. This recording is a tour de force of hard-hitting, emotionally driven prog rock. Right from the opening of the title track to the final, thundering chord of Starless, this album takes you on a dark trip through a world of tension, loss, and uncertain ends. Despite whatever difficulties led to them splitting up, the band works together amazingly well in both their composition and performance on this album. The lineup on Red is an all-star team with bassist and vocalist John Wetton, drummer Bill Bruford, who had left Yes a few years earlier, and Robert Fripp on guitars. And of course, a big part of Red's sound comes from its horn and string section, which is provided by longtime King Crimson contributors Mel Collins, Ian MacDonald, and David Cross. Not that one. It all adds up to a spectacular soundscape, which has been amazingly captured on this vinyl release. See how neatly I transitioned into that topic? I hope that worked. Anyway, this copy of the album is a reissue from 1987 that was released on EG Editions, with wax number EGKC8. Now this is a very high quality pressing. The sound quality is top notch and the mastering doesn't pull any punches. This is actually a half-speed mastered album, as a matter of fact, and if you don't know, that's a technique where the master lacquer for the record is cut from the master tape at half the regular speed. A lot of people say this makes the record more precise and more dynamic when it's played back at regular speed, but other people say that it doesn't really do much of anything. Whatever the case, it certainly didn't hurt the quality of the record, because it turned out great. And you want a great pressing for an album like this, because it's full of complex arrangements and really dynamic sound changes. As soon as you drop the needle, you know that this isn't going to be an easy listening album. This is the title track, Red. In typical King Crimson fashion, it's packed with complicated chord progressions and layered arrangements. Just like 21st Century Schizoid Man from their first album, Red hits you with an almost overwhelming wall of sound. But, where Schizoid Man was influenced by jazz arrangements, Red is much darker and heavier sounding, relying on seething guitars, thundering bass, and one really ominous Baroque string section. This song sets the mood for the album. It's dark, it's bold, it's tense. And I really think tension is an overarching theme on this record, and it's presented in a number of creative ways here. You'll notice that the volume level on Red sounds sort of quiet, even though the arrangement is played loud. Once it transitions into Fallen Angel, though, the volume suddenly swells louder than ever in this big mushroom cloud of bass. That's when you realize that the levels on Red were lower. It gives the impression that the music has been straining against the limits of the mastering. It makes the image on the back cover really appropriate, a gauge with the needle hitting the red line. Fallen Angel deals with a different kind of tension, the difference between two brothers, one who falls in with an inner city gang and the other who remains outside of it all but eventually sees his brother die on the streets. It's a haunting, beautiful song that starts out as a seemingly simple acoustic ballad and then builds to a great thundering dirge filled with horn and cornet blasts from Mel Collins and Ian MacDonald. Interestingly, the ending of Fallen Angel seems to share a lot in common with the Beatles' song I Want You, She's So Heavy, with both songs ending with a repetition of the same minor chord progression while the band chants one line over and over. In both songs, the effect is intense and seems to draw you in inescapably. And the heaviness continues as we move into One More Red Nightmare, which is a big, terrifying ride through a fever dream or hallucination of some kind. Just when you thought Fallen Angel was loud, this song gets even louder. Right from the start, the overdriven guitar and ominous gong make you feel like you're in the grip of some wild, raging beast. Then later the swirling drum line and horn section really gives you a disorienting, fever-like feeling that captures the nightmare theme of the song. The composition here is superb. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention John Wetton's suave yet rough tenor. These songs would be great in any case, but his voice talent adds a whole new level to them musically.
Just sitting musing, the virtues of cruising, when altitude dropping, my ears started popping.
So side one ends with a rough cut from feedback into silence. As we move into side two, though, we get a very quiet, almost ethereal violin intro to the song Providence. Now, Providence is interesting since it shares a lot in common with another King Crimson song, Moonchild. Both of these songs come at the start of side 2 on their albums. Both are about 8 minutes long, and both of them are not easy songs to get into. They're both abstract, semi-improvised pieces that sometimes seem to descend into random noise. But Providence seems to have the opposite structure to Moonchild, where Moonchild starts off as a traditionally structured song and then descends into these soft, muted improvisations. Providence starts out as an unstructured collection of instruments and gradually builds into a coherent jazz rock melody. In that sense, the title Providence fits well. See, just like Providence refers to a divine, overarching will that acts to create and structure things, this song is made up of parts that seem random and chaotic but eventually form part of a greater whole. It's also interesting to note that this was recorded at a live concert with David Cross on violin, who left the band before Red was completed. It shows how many changes King Crimson was going through, and it captures the band's dedication to improvised pieces. And then we come to the conclusion of Red with what is quite possibly King Crimson's greatest single work. Beethoven had Symphony No. 9, Wagner had Ride of the Valkyries, Gershwin had Rhapsody in Blue, and King Crimson had Starless. I feel that Starless captures just about everything that defines King Crimson as a band, or at least its first major period as a band. We have dark, haunting, and very complex composition, a long, multi-section symphonic structure, and disillusioned, anxious lyrics that create an almost dirge-like feeling. The song starts off with the mellotron playing distant, ominous minor chords like a ghostly orchestra. Next comes Fripp's mournful, weeping guitar. It sets the mood for a song that's as dark as the title suggests. And as always, Wetton delivers vocals that add to the instrumentation perfectly. The lyrics to Starless are true poetry. They reveal enough about the subject to catch your interest, but are vague enough to captivate your imagination and keep you coming back to them. The lines are almost haiku-like in their shortness and simplicity, yet there's just enough detail to make you turn them over in your mind. I feel like the main themes here are depression, loneliness, and helplessness. There's imagery of not being able to find happiness in a dazzling sunset because the mind can only focus on starless blackness. It's a universal theme as much as we may not want to admit it, since I think we all go through times of darkness and depression at some point in our lives. The lyrics also come back to that theme of tension and not being at peace with oneself or the world. But if you think the lyrics are intense, the next section of the song will destroy you. After the final verse, we move into some of the heaviest moments in progressive rock history, if not rock music in general. Everything fades away into the blackness and we're left with only Wetton's low, menacing bass line. The guitar returns, playing this single note, creeping motif that keeps building and building in intensity, along with these high, screeching notes that almost sound like something metallic moving into the background. Bruford's drums also come back in a dissonant, almost chaotic sounding rhythm. And this is where the album's theme of tension really comes into play. Once all these parts reach a fever pitch, the song shifts time signatures to a tight, repetitious rhythm. The guitar starts playing a tight, repeating chord structure more and more intensely, and if you listen to the production, the left and right channels move closer and closer together as it builds. There's a palpable sense of pressure as everything is pushed to the breaking point, until it explodes. In the final part of the song, the tension breaks open as the instruments run wild and repeat the opening theme. It's extremely cathartic to listen to, as if all the emotions earlier in the song are being released into the air. The last moments of Starless end with a hard rock, heart-pounding reprise. It seems almost impossibly loud and impossibly heavy compared with the opening. And so Red fades out on a dark, menacing chord just as it started. This is one of the most powerful moments in rock that I've ever heard. It leaves me in awe. It's an incredibly strong finale to an incredibly strong album. So with music this good, Red should have propelled King Crimson to unprecedented heights of success, right? Well, no. During the recording of the album, Robert Fripp became increasingly withdrawn from the group and from the music industry in general. Finally, just as the band was getting ready to release the album, he announced that he didn't want to tour, saying that he felt as though the world was coming to an end. The group officially broke up in September 1974, weeks before Red was released. With no band to promote the album, Red didn't become nearly as successful as it might have on the charts. In that context, the album's theme takes on a whole new meaning. That final movement of Starless isn't just an explosion of the inner tensions on the album, it's the explosion of King Crimson as a band, with that final rumbling chord signaling the end of the band in its first major form. But that doesn't mean Red was a failure or forgotten. Red was almost universally praised by music critics for its creative composition, intensity, and dynamic performances by the musicians. It was so good that even Robert Christgau had to put aside his hatred of prog rock to give it an A-. And its musical influence can't be denied either. The dark, heavy style on Red didn't just shape the sound of progressive rock, it was also an influence on many subgenres of heavy metal. It's actually very easy to spot the elements of metal throughout Red. All of this adds up to make Red a very important album and a very unforgettable album. People, if you haven't listened to this album, I was lucky enough to get a vintage copy in great condition, and I'm sure I'll be enjoying it for a long time to come. Thanks for watching, folks. Hope you enjoyed my ramblings.